Mr. Carmichael, what a laughable defense. Did you lose your voice, or did you finally realize your place in my courtroom? Sneered attorney Brian Malcolm, a smug grin spreading across his face. He leaned back in his chair, confident in his performance before the jury. Across the room, the defendant, an unassuming man with graying hair and a calm demeanor, simply stared back at him without flinching. The courtroom was silent, save for the shuffle of papers and the occasional cough from the gallery. Even the judge, a usually stern figure, looked momentarily puzzled at the lack of response. The defendant, identified in court as John Carmichael, hadn't uttered a word throughout the trial. The silence stretched, and Malcolm chuckled again. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I believe Mr. Carmichael's quietness speaks volumes. He knows there's no getting out of this. Guilty as charged. The attorney's voice boomed, and he smirked at the jury's amused expressions. Then it happened. John Carmichael's eyes flicked up, sharp as steel. His quiet voice broke the tension like a whip crack. Do you ever wonder what it's like to be outsmarted by someone you underestimated? Malcolm froze mid-smirk. I've been silent for a reason, Carmichael continued, standing slowly. His movements were deliberate, his expression unreadable. And you just played right into my hands. He reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a slim leather wallet. Flipping it open with a single fluid motion, he revealed a badge. John Carmichael, former FBI special agent. And as of this moment, I'm formally indicting you for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to defraud the court. The room erupted into chaos. Malcolm stumbled backward, his face draining of color. Who were you talking about? This is a joke. A stunt to sway the jury, he stammered, his bravado crumbling. Carmichael didn't blink. You thought I was some helpless defendant you could humiliate. But I've been watching you for years, Malcolm. Every shady deal, every bribe, every time you twisted the law for your gain. And I've got the evidence to back it up. The judge banged the gavel furiously. Order in the court. Carmichael didn't flinch, his voice steady. Your Honor, I request an immediate recess to present my findings to federal authorities. The judge's eyes darted between Carmichael, the badge at his hand, and the now sweating Malcolm. The gavel struck again. Court is adjourned for recess. It all started 6 months earlier, on an unremarkable Tuesday in a quiet suburban neighborhood. John Carmichael lived a simple life, at least, that's what his neighbors believed. To them, he was a widower who kept to himself, spending most days tending to his garden or walking his golden retriever Max. What they didn't know was that John had once been one of the FBI's top undercover agents, specializing in infiltrating high-stakes criminal enterprises. His last mission had gone sideways, leaving his cover blown and his wife tragically caught in the crossfire. Devastated, he left the bureau and tried to build a life in obscurity. But trouble had a way of finding him. One evening, as John sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, a black sedan pulled up in front of his house. 2 men in suits stepped out, their expressions grim. John's hand instinctively tightened around the mug, his mind racing. Mr. Carmichael, one of the men began, holding up an FBI badge. We need your help. John sighed, leaning back in his chair. I'm retired. Not anymore, the agent replied. We've got a problem, and it's got your name written all over it. Reluctantly, John invited them inside. Over the next hour, the agents laid out their case. Brian Malcolm, a high-profile defense attorney, was suspected of using his position to cover up crimes for powerful clients. Bribery, evidence tampering, witness intimidation. His methods were as diverse as they were despicable. And you think I'm the guy to bring him down? John asked, skeptical. The younger agent nodded. We need someone with your experience. Someone who knows how to play the long game. Malcolm's slippery, but we believe you can catch him in the act. John considered their plea. He had sworn off his old life, but the thought of letting Malcolm continue to mock justice gnawed at him. After a long pause, he gave a single nod. I'm in. The plan was simple in theory, but execution required finesse. John would pose as a defendant in a fabricated case, drawing Malcolm's attention. The FBI had already laid the groundwork, planting false evidence that made John appear to be a wealthy businessman accused of embezzlement. Malcolm, predictably, took the bait. Their first meeting was uneventful. Malcolm was confident, his cocky demeanor grating on John's nerves. The attorney promised to make the case disappear for a hefty fee, which John pretended to reluctantly agree to. Over the weeks that followed, John recorded every interaction, collecting a mountain of incriminating evidence. He endured Malcolm's condescending remarks and thinly veiled threats, all while playing the part of a desperate man clinging to his last hope. In the courtroom, the stakes rose. Malcolm's performance was flawless, painting John as a greedy opportunist. The jury seemed swayed, nodding along to his arguments. John remained silent, biding his time. Then came the moment of reckoning. The courtroom descended into pandemonium after John's revelation. Malcolm's carefully crafted persona unraveled before everyone's eyes. But this wasn't the end, far from it. John had waited years for this moment, but he knew the real battle was just beginning. The chaos in the courtroom was deafening. Spectators whispered furiously, jurors exchanged confused glances, and Brian Malcolm looked like a man cornered by his worst nightmare. The judge banged the gavel again, his voice rising above the din. "This court is adjourned until further notice." The bailiff motioned for everyone to vacate, but the tension in the room hung like a storm cloud. As people filtered out, John remained seated, his posture calm despite the turmoil surrounding him. Malcolm, still frozen in place, glared at John. "You think you've won?" he hissed under his breath. "You have no idea who you're messing with." John's lips curled into a faint smile. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with." Malcolm shoved his papers into his briefcase, his hands trembling. Without another word, he stormed out of the courtroom, brushing past reporters who were already crowding the hallway. John didn't leave immediately. He sat quietly as the courtroom emptied, his thoughts racing. He had played his part perfectly, but he knew this was only the first step. Malcolm wasn't just a corrupt lawyer, he was a man with powerful connections. Exposing him in open court was bold, but it was also dangerous. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. "Agent Ruiz." "Good timing," John muttered as he answered. "Carmichael," Ruiz's voice crackled through the line. "That was a hell of a move. Malcolm's people are scrambling, and the press is already eating it up. But you need to be careful. He's not the type to go down without a fight." "I figured as much," John replied. "What's our next step?" "We've got a safe house ready. You'll need to lay low for a while. This might escalate faster than we anticipated." John sighed. He was used to living in the shadows, but he hadn't expected to dive back into this kind of danger so soon. "Send me the address." The safe house was tucked away on the outskirts of the city, a nondescript single-story home surrounded by overgrown bushes. Inside, it was sparse but functional. A small kitchen, a living room with outdated furniture, and a bedroom with a single bed. John dropped his bag by the door and immediately scanned the place for any signs of surveillance or tampering. Old habits died hard. Satisfied it was secure, he settled onto the couch and opened his laptop. His inbox was flooded with emails from the FBI team coordinating the operation. They had already compiled a list of Malcolm's known associates, judges, police officers, and even politicians, all suspected of being complicit in his schemes. John frowned. This wasn't just about taking down one corrupt lawyer. It was about dismantling an entire network. And that meant he was in for a much bigger fight than he'd anticipated. Meanwhile, Malcolm was far from idle. Back in his office, he slammed his briefcase onto his desk, scattering papers everywhere. His assistant, a nervous young woman named Lisa, hovered nearby. "Cancel all my meetings," Malcolm barked, his voice sharp. "And give me a secure line." Lisa hesitated. "Sir, is everything?" "Do it." Malcolm snapped, his tone leaving no room for argument. As Lisa hurried out, Malcolm locked his office door and sat down. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number from memory. After a few tense rings, a gravelly voice answered. "Malcolm." "We've got a problem," Malcolm said, his voice low. "That defendant I've been working with, he's not who he says he is. He's a former FBI agent." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Then, you're sure? I saw the badge myself. He's been playing me this whole time." The voice chuckled darkly. "If he's FBI, then he's a threat. We'll handle it." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Make it quick. The longer he's out there, the more damage he can do. Consider it done." John's uneventful evening was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up outside the safe house. He peered through the blinds, his instincts on high alert. A black SUV idled in the driveway, its windows tinted. He moved quickly, grabbing his sidearm from his bag and positioning himself near the front door. His heart pounded, but his mind was clear. If they had found him, he had no choice but to fight. The knock on the door was firm but not aggressive. John didn't respond. He waited, listening for any movement outside. "Mr. Carmichael," a voice called. "It's Agent Ruiz. Open up." John relaxed slightly, but didn't lower his weapon. He opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain latched. Ruiz stood on the other side, holding up his badge. "We need to talk," Ruiz said, stepping inside once John unlatched the door. John shut it quickly and turned to face the agent. "What's going on?" Ruiz looked grim. "Malcolm's already retaliating. We intercepted chatter about a hit being put out on you. You're not safe here." John's jaw tightened. "Let me guess, they sent professionals." Ruiz nodded. "We're moving you to a secondary location. This one's been compromised." As they prepared to leave, headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as they approached the house. John and Ruiz exchanged a glance, both reaching for their weapons. "Stay back," Ruiz whispered, moving toward the window. Before he could reach it, the front door exploded inward, sending splinters flying across the room. John hit the ground, covering his head as armed men stormed in, their faces masked and their weapons raised. Down on the ground, one of them barked. John's mind raced. He wasn't about to let himself be taken without a fight. He locked eyes with Ruiz, who gave a subtle nod. They had to act fast. In a blur of motion, John rolled to his side and fired at the nearest assailant, dropping him instantly. Ruiz followed suit, taking cover behind the overturned couch as bullets tore through the walls. The living room erupted into chaos as John and Ruiz fought back, but the attackers were well coordinated. John knew they couldn't hold out forever. "Back door," Ruiz shouted, motioning for John to retreat. John hesitated for a split second, then nodded. They scrambled toward the kitchen, dodging gunfire. Just as they reached the door, a masked man stepped into their path, raising his weapon. John reacted instinctively, lunging forward and knocking the gun aside. The two men grappled, their struggle fierce and desperate. Ruiz fired at another attacker, but there were too many. As the masked man gained the upper hand, pinning John against the counter, he sneered through his mask. "You should have stayed in retirement, old man." John's expression hardened. "You should have done your homework." With a surge of strength, he twisted free, slamming the man's head into the counter. The attacker crumpled to the floor, unconscious. But just as John turned to follow Ruiz, he felt the cold barrel of a gun press against the back of his head. "Don't move," a voice growled. John froze, his mind racing for a way out. The fight wasn't over yet. The cold barrel of the gun pressed harder against the back of John's head, a silent reminder of how quickly a situation could turn. His heart pounded, but his expression remained calm. He had been in tighter spots than this before. "Drop the weapon," the masked man behind him demanded. John's hand tightened on the grip of his gun, weighing his options. He could hear Ruiz still engaged in a firefight in the next room. If he surrendered, they'd both be dead within minutes. The attacker jabbed him with the gun. "I said." John moved. In a fluid motion, he ducked low, spun around, and grabbed the man's wrist. The gun fired, the shot going wild and shattering a cabinet behind them. Before the attacker could react, John drove his knee into the man's stomach, sending him sprawling to the floor. He snatched the gun from the man's grip and fired 2 precise shots, neutralizing another assailant who had rushed into the kitchen. The room fell momentarily silent, save for John's heavy breathing. "Ruiz," he called out, moving toward the living room. "I'm good," Ruiz shouted back, emerging from behind the couch, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. "But we need to go now." John nodded, grabbing a small bag of essentials he had stashed earlier. The two men moved swiftly through the house, heading toward the garage. They could hear the sound of reinforcements arriving outside, more engines, more voices. As they entered the garage, Ruiz hit the button to open the door, but nothing happened. The mechanism had been disabled. "Figures," Ruiz muttered. "We'll have to blast our way out." John scanned the room, his eyes landing on an old pickup truck parked in the corner. "Get in." Ruiz hesitated. "That thing looks like it hasn't run since the Clinton administration." John smirked, sliding into the driver's seat. "They don't make them like this anymore." He yanked open the glove compartment, retrieving a pair of jumper wires. Within seconds, the engine roared to life, coughing and sputtering like an old dog waking up from nap. Ruiz climbed into the passenger seat, clutching his gun. Let's hope it still has some fight left in it. The garage door suddenly exploded inward, debris flying as masked attackers stormed in. John slammed the truck into reverse, the tires screeching as they backed up. Gunfire erupted, bullets pinging off the truck's frame. John floored the gas pedal, crashing through the remnants of the garage door and sending attackers diving for cover. The truck barreled down the driveway, skidding onto the main road as more SUVs gave chase. The pursuit was relentless. John maneuvered the truck through the narrow streets, the engine groaning with the effort. Ruiz leaned out the window, firing at their pursuers, but the SUVs were faster and better equipped. They're gaining on us, Ruiz shouted. John gritted his teeth, his eyes scanning the road ahead. They needed an edge, something to level the playing field. He spotted an overpass up ahead, its support columns lining the street like concrete sentinels. Hold on, John said, yanking the wheel hard to the right. The truck veered sharply, tires screeching as it swerved between the columns. The SUVs followed, their drivers struggling to keep pace. One miscalculated, slamming into a column and erupting in a fireball. The remaining vehicles pressed on, more cautious now. John spotted an opportunity, a narrow alley that the SUVs couldn't follow. He accelerated, the truck's frame barely squeezing through the gap. Behind them, the SUVs skidded to a halt, their drivers shouting in frustration. We're clear, for now, John said, his grip on the wheel tight. Ruiz slumped back in his seat, exhaling deeply. That was close. Too close. They didn't stop until they were miles away, deep in the industrial outskirts of the city. John pulled the truck into an abandoned warehouse, killing the engine. The silence was deafening after the chaos of the chase. Ruiz climbed out, inspecting the bullet holes that peppered the truck's frame. We're going to need a new ride. John nodded, checking his weapon. And a new plan. They're not going to stop coming. Ruiz leaned against the truck, wiping sweat from his brow. You think Malcolm's behind this? John gave him a sharp look. Who else? He knows I've got the evidence to bury him. He's pulling every string he's got to take me out before I can use it. Ruiz frowned. We need to move fast. If he's got this kind of reach, we're not just dealing with a corrupt lawyer. This goes higher, much higher. John nodded, his mind already racing. He had suspected Malcolm's network was extensive, but this kind of response confirmed it. They weren't just trying to silence him. They were trying to erase him. Meanwhile, Malcolm sat in his penthouse office, sipping a glass of scotch as he watched the city lights twinkle below. His phone buzzed, and he answered without hesitation. Well, he asked, his tone impatient. The gravelly voice on the other end hesitated. Carmichael got away. We lost him. Malcolm's hand tightened around the glass, his knuckles turning white. You lost him? Do you have any idea what he's capable of? We underestimated him, the voice admitted. But we'll find him. It's only a matter of time. Malcolm slammed the glass onto his desk, shattering it. Time is the one thing we don't have. If he gets that evidence to the authorities, we're all finished. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. Double the bounty. I want every resource we have focused on finding him. And when you do, I want him alive. I'll deal with him myself. The voice on the other end hesitated. And Ruiz. Malcolm's lips curled into a cold smile. Collateral damage. Back at the warehouse, John and Ruiz were already planning their next move. John spread a map across the hood of the truck, marking key locations with a pen. We need to get this evidence into federal hands, Ruiz said. But they've got eyes everywhere. We can't just walk into an FBI field office without being spotted. John nodded, tapping a point on the map. There's a safe courier route through the old subway tunnels. It's risky, but it's our best shot. Ruiz frowned. If they find us down there, we'll have nowhere to run. That's why we need to stay ahead of them, John replied. They'll be expecting us to go to ground, but we're going to keep moving. We don't stop until Malcolm's empire falls. Ruiz studied John's face, noting the determination in his eyes. You've done this before, haven't you? John's expression darkened. More times than I care to remember. The two men exchanged a nod, their resolve firm. But just as they prepared to leave, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the warehouse. John grabbed his weapon, his jaw tightening. They've found us. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The warehouse fell silent except for the faint hum of engines approaching in the distance. John and Ruiz exchanged a tense look. They had barely caught their breath, and the enemy was already closing in. They don't waste time, do they? Ruiz muttered, checking his weapon. John grabbed his bag and quickly scanned the space. They know we're here, but they don't know what they're walking into. Let's make it difficult for them. Ruiz followed as John moved swiftly, setting up traps with the limited supplies on hand. An old oil drum became an impromptu barricade, while loose industrial equipment was strategically placed to trip or slow down anyone entering. John's years of experience in the field were evident as he worked methodically. The low rumble of engines grew louder. Headlights swept across the broken windows, cutting through the darkness like searchlights. Here they come, John said, crouching behind a stack of crates near the back entrance. He motioned for Ruiz to take position behind a large steel beam. The vehicles stopped just outside and doors slammed. Muffled voices carried through the night as the attackers coordinated their approach. John counted at least 6 distinct voices, probably more waiting in the wings. Then came the sound of boots crunching on gravel. The first attacker stepped cautiously into the warehouse, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. Behind him, another followed, their weapons raised and ready. John stayed still, his breathing steady as he watched from the shadows. When the lead man passed the oil drum, John fired a single, precise shot. The drum tipped over, spilling its contents, slick oil spreading rapidly across the concrete floor. The attackers stumbled, one of them slipping and falling hard. Contact! Someone shouted, and gunfire erupted. John and Ruiz returned fire, using the cover of the crates and steel beams. The attackers were well armed, their bullets tearing through the flimsy structures, but John's tactical advantage was in his planning. A stack of metal pipes, loosened earlier, came crashing down onto one of the attackers, taking him out of the fight. Ruiz fired 2 quick shots, hitting another assailant square in the chest. "That's 3 down," he called, ducking his return fire rain down. "5 to go," John replied, his tone calm but focused. He moved along the perimeter, staying low and using the shadows to his advantage. Outside, the remaining attackers regrouped. A man in a black tactical vest, clearly the leader, barked orders into his radio. "Sweep the building. Keep them pinned down. They're not leaving here alive." He motioned for another squad to flank the warehouse. The sound of heavy boots on gravel echoed as reinforcements closed in. Inside, John and Ruiz were running out of options. The attackers had them boxed in, their firepower overwhelming. Ruiz fired another shot, but his ammunition was dwindling. "We can't hold this position much longer," Ruiz said, reloading his weapon with shaky hands. John's eyes darted around the warehouse, searching for an escape. His gaze landed on a rusted maintenance ladder leading up to the roof. "We're going up." Ruiz hesitated. "And then what?" "Jump into their arms." John gave him a sharp look. "Trust me." The 2 men scrambled up the ladder, bullets pinging off the metal rungs. The attackers noticed their movement and redirected their fire, but John and Ruiz reached the roof just in time. The rooftop was expansive but treacherous, with rusted beams and loose panels threatening to give way underfoot. John led the way, staying low to avoid being silhouetted against the night sky. "Over there," John said, pointing to a ventilation shaft that led down to an adjacent building. "We can use that to get out of here." Ruiz glanced back toward the warehouse entrance. More attackers were flooding in. "They're going to figure out we're up here." "Then we'd better move fast," John replied. The 2 men reached the shaft and pried it open, but just as they prepared to climb in, a gunshot rang out. Ruiz stumbled, clutching his shoulder. "Ruiz!" John grabbed him before he could fall, dragging him to cover behind a ventilation unit. Blood seeped through Ruiz's fingers as he pressed a hand to the wound. "I'm fine," Ruiz said through gritted teeth, though his pale face told a different story. John peeked out from behind the unit, spotting the sniper on a nearby rooftop. The man was adjusting his scope, lining up another shot. John's mind raced. He needed to act fast. "Stay here," he told Ruiz, handing him his spare weapon. "Cover me." Before Ruiz could protest, John sprinted across the rooftop, zigzagging to make himself a harder target. The sniper fired, the bullet missing by inches. John dove behind another vent, pulling out his sidearm. He took a deep breath, then popped up and fired. The sniper's head snapped back, and he crumpled out of sight. John hurried back to Ruiz, who was struggling to stay upright. "We've got to move," John said, helping him to his feet. Together, they climbed into the ventilation shaft, their escape slow and arduous with Ruiz injured. The shaft led them to an abandoned factory adjacent to the warehouse. They emerged into a dark, musty room filled with broken machinery and stacks of rusted barrels. John secured the door behind him, giving them a moment to catch their breath. Ruiz leaned against the wall, his face pale and slick with sweat. "I don't think I can go much farther," he admitted, his voice weak. John crouched beside him, examining the wound. The bullet had passed cleanly through, but the blood loss was significant. "You're going to be fine," John said, his tone firm. "I've got a med kit in the bag. Just hold on." As John worked to stop the bleeding, Ruiz's eyes fluttered closed. "John," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Stay with me," John said, shaking him lightly. Ruiz's eyes opened, though they were glassy. "Do you think Malcolm knows we're this close?" John didn't answer right away. He tightened the bandage around Ruiz's shoulder and sat back. "He knows," he said finally. "That's why he's throwing everything he has at us." Ruiz nodded weakly, his breathing steadying. "Then let's make it count." John helped him to his feet. "We will. But first, we need to disappear again." As they prepared to leave, John's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, surprised to see an encrypted message from an unknown number. It was a single line of text. "You're not the only one after Malcolm. Meet me tomorrow, 10 a.m., St. James Park." John frowned, showing the message to Ruiz. "Looks like we're not alone in this." "Or it's a trap," Ruiz replied, his voice still weak. "Either way," John said, pocketing the phone, "we're about to find out." But as they moved toward the exit, the faint sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. John froze, his hand on his weapon. "Looks like they're not done yet," he muttered. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The faint echo of footsteps grew louder, steady and deliberate. John motioned for Ruiz to stay back, his own weapon raised as he moved toward the source of the noise. The abandoned factory shadows seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowing the dim light that filtered through broken windows. John's breathing slowed as he focused, ears straining to pinpoint the direction of the sound. Then it stopped. The sudden silence was unnerving, sending a chill up his spine. "John," Ruiz whispered hoarsely from behind a rusted column. "We've got to go." John nodded but didn't lower his weapon. Something fell off. His instincts, honed over years of field work, screamed at him that this wasn't an ordinary sweep. Whoever was out there wasn't moving like the usual grunts. Then it happened, a soft clink, like metal striking the ground. "Grenade!" John shouted, diving behind a workbench as the device exploded. The room filled with a deafening roar, and shards of metal flew in all directions. Dust and debris clouded the air, choking their vision and making every breath a struggle. John coughed, his ears ringing. "Ruiz," he called, scrambling to his feet. I'm here," Ruiz groaned, crawling out from behind the column. Blood smeared his face from a fresh cut above his eyebrow, but he was alive. John helped him up, but before they could move, a laser sight danced across the wall near them. "Snipers!" John yanked Ruiz down just as a bullet ricocheted off the metal beam behind them. "We're pinned," Ruiz rasped. John scanned the room, his mind racing. The factory's layout was a maze of machinery and storage units, but the attackers had the advantage of positioning and firepower. They couldn't stay here. "We need to flush them out," John said, grabbing a piece of jagged scrap metal and tossing it across the room. It clattered loudly, drawing a barrage of gunfire. "Amateurs," John muttered, using the distraction to lead Ruiz toward a service elevator at the far end of the factory. The ancient contraption looked barely functional, but it was their only way up to the catwalks where they could get a better vantage point. As the two reached the elevator, more footsteps echoed, this time from multiple directions. The attackers were closing in. John hit the button repeatedly, but the elevator didn't budge. Come on," he muttered. He pried open the control panel, his fingers working quickly to bypass the wiring. Sparks flew, and the elevator groaned to life. "Get in," John barked, pulling Ruiz inside. As the elevator began its agonizingly slow ascent, the attackers burst into the room. Bullets peppered the elevator's metal doors, one punching through and narrowly missing Ruiz. "They're going to follow us," Ruiz said, wincing as he pressed a hand to his shoulder wound. "Let them," John replied, his eyes scanning the catwalks above. He had a plan, but it was risky. The elevator creaked to a halt, and John pulled Ruiz out, dragging him toward a control room perched high above the factory floor. Inside, it was cramped and dusty, but it offered a bird's-eye view of the chaos below. John spotted the attackers spreading out, their movements coordinated. They were professionals, unlike the first wave they'd faced earlier. "They're pushing us into a corner," Ruiz said, slumping against a console. John glanced at him. Ruiz was pale, his breathing shallow. He wouldn't last much longer without proper medical attention. They needed to end this fast. John's eyes fell on a set of controls labeled overhead cranes. A smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "I think I just found our way out." He flipped the switches, and the factory roared to life. Massive cranes swung into motion, their heavy chains rattling as they moved. The attackers below shouted in confusion, some diving for cover as the machinery groaned and shifted. John grabbed an industrial radio from the console, tuning it to a frequency he picked up earlier. He pressed the button, his voice cutting through the static. "You've got two choices," he said, his tone ice cold. "Walk out now, or stay and find out how creative I can get." There was no response, but John could see the hesitation in their movements. The cranes were unpredictable, their swinging loads threatening to collapse the unstable structure at any moment. The attackers regrouped, their leader barking orders. But before they could act, John pushed the final lever, sending one of the cranes crashing into a support column. The impact was deafening, and the floor below buckled. "Time to go," John said, pulling Ruiz to his feet. They moved quickly along the catwalk, heading toward an emergency exit. The factory groaned as the damaged structure began to give way. Below, the attackers scrambled to escape the collapsing floor, some disappearing into the swirling dust and debris. John and Ruiz burst through the exit, emerging into the cold night air. They didn't stop, running until they reached the nearby service road. A solitary car sat parked, its engine idling. John's hand went to his weapon as the driver's side door opened. A tall woman stepped out, dressed in tactical gear. She held up her hands, showing she was unarmed. "Carmichael?" she asked, her voice steady. John's eyes narrowed. "Who's asking?" "Special Agent Sophia Turner," she said, holding up a badge. "I sent a message. We need to talk." Ruiz, leaning heavily on John, managed a weak laugh. "You've got some nerve showing up now." Turner ignored him, her gaze fixed on John. "You don't have time to argue. Malcolm's pulling every string he's got to bring you down. If you want to survive this, you're going to need my help." John studied her face, searching for any hint of deception. Finally, he nodded. "Fine. But if this is a trap—" "It's not," she interrupted. "Get in the car. I'll explain everything." Reluctantly, John helped Ruiz into the back seat, then climbed into the passenger side. Turner slid behind the wheel, pulling onto the road as the factory collapsed in the distance. "You've got a lot of explaining to do," John said, his tone sharp. "And you've got a lot to learn," Turner replied, her expression grim. "This isn't just about Malcolm. He's part of something much bigger, and you just kicked the hornet's nest." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air as the car sped into the night, leaving the ruins of the factory and the first chapter of their battle behind. The car sped through the darkened streets, the headlights cutting through the misty air. John sat in the passenger seat, his mind racing. The encounter at the factory had been close, but the words from Sophia Turner echoed in his mind. This isn't just about Malcolm. He's part of something much bigger. He glanced back at Ruiz, who was still struggling to stay conscious, his body pressed against the seat with his eyes half-lidded. His condition was worsening. The bullet wound wasn't fatal, but the blood loss combined with the stress of the chase was taking its toll. "We need to get him to a hospital," John said quietly, his tone more to himself than anyone else. Turner's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, assessing Ruiz's condition. "I'll take you to a place where we can get him patched up." "But the clock's ticking." "We don't have much time." John didn't answer. He knew what she meant. They were all running out of time, and the danger only seemed to grow with each passing moment. The drive took them out of the city, heading into the outskirts, where the lights were few and the road seemed endless. After about 30 minutes, they pulled up to an unmarked building, just an old industrial warehouse, much like the ones they'd fought their way out of earlier, except this one was clearly in better shape. The area seemed abandoned, its perimeter surrounded by tall fences and dense trees. Turner cut the engine and turned to John. "This is where we lay low for now. It's secure." John hesitated but nodded, helping Ruiz out of the car. The place felt strange, its cold exterior at odds with the warmth of safety Turner was offering. But the last few days had taught him that he couldn't afford to be too trusting. He had learned that lesson the hard way in his past. They entered the building, which was surprisingly well lit on the inside, with equipment neatly arranged along the walls. A handful of people, all wearing tactical gear, glanced up as they entered but didn't speak. A woman with short black hair came forward, her eyes scanning John and Ruiz. "Doc," Turner said, "we've got a situation." The woman nodded and immediately went to work, directing them to a nearby operating table. John gently laid Ruiz down, watching as the doctor examined the wound. "Lucky it didn't hit anything major," the doctor said, "but he'll need stitches and rest." John stood back, rubbing his eyes. The exhaustion was catching up to him. His body was aching from the fight, but he couldn't allow himself to relax. "Not yet. Why aren't you in uniform?" John asked Turner, his voice sharp. Turner didn't flinch. "I'm not on the same team as the Bureau anymore. Things got complicated. But that doesn't matter right now." John raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly do you want with me?" Sophia's expression hardened. "We're going after Malcolm, but we can't do it alone. What you did back at the factory, that was a good start, but it's only the tip of the iceberg. Malcolm's network isn't just corrupt lawyers or crooked judges. He's in bed with some of the most dangerous players in the city." "Dangerous players?" John asked, his eyes narrowing. "Who?" Sophia exchanged a look with the doctor. Then she turned back to John, her voice lowering. "I can't tell you everything right now. But I'll say this much, Malcolm's been laundering money for one of the biggest crime syndicates in the country. And it's not just about cash. We're talking about arms deals, human trafficking, and a whole web of illegal activity that reaches into every corner of the city." John's mind spun. He'd known Malcolm was dirty, but he hadn't realized just how deep the corruption ran. "And you want me to help you take him down?" John asked, still processing the information. Turner nodded, her expression resolute. "You're the one who's got the evidence. And trust me, Carmichael, you've got more enemies than you realize. If we don't act quickly, they'll destroy everything you've worked for. And that includes Ruiz's life." John turned to look at his partner, who had fallen unconscious, sweat beading on his forehead. His mind raced with thoughts of revenge. He had started this for justice, for the closure of his past, but now it felt much bigger, much darker. "We don't have the luxury of time," John said, his voice steely. "What's the next step?" Sophia's eyes flickered with something like relief. "First, we let Ruiz rest. Then, we dig into the information you've gathered. I've got contacts who can help us move the evidence without it getting intercepted." John exhaled sharply. He hated feeling like he was part of a game that he didn't fully understand. But he had no choice. His mission now wasn't just about bringing down Malcolm. It was about taking down a criminal empire. As the hours passed, John sat in a corner, his mind turning over every piece of the puzzle. The factory, the sniper, the people coming after him, they were all connected. But how? Sophia's words echoed in his mind. "You've got more enemies than you realize." He knew she was right, but it was more than that. He wasn't just fighting against Malcolm's criminal network. He was fighting against his own past. The next morning, after Ruiz had gotten some rest and was feeling slightly better, Sophia came to John with a new lead. "We've tracked down one of Malcolm's lieutenants," she said, holding up a tablet. "He's scheduled to meet with someone at a secure location this afternoon. This is our chance to get to him before he can cover his tracks." John glanced at the map on the screen, which showed an old, run-down mansion on the outskirts of town. He studied it for a moment, weighing his options. "We go in, get the information, and get out," John said firmly. "We don't risk staying longer than necessary. Malcolm's people will be watching." Sophia nodded, and Ruiz, still weak but alert, gave a thumbs up. "Let's finish this," he muttered. The drive to the mansion was uneventful, but John could feel the tension building. His grip on his weapon tightened as they neared their target. They had no idea what they were walking into, but he was prepared for anything. When they arrived, the mansion appeared abandoned, its windows boarded up and its once grand facade weathered by time. They parked a block away and made their way on foot, taking cover behind trees and bushes. The closer they got, the more John felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Something didn't feel right. They moved through the overgrown yard, silent as shadows, until they reached the back of the house. The faint sound of voices drifted through the cracked window, confirming that their target was inside. John motioned for the others to stay behind. "I'll go in first," he whispered. Before they could respond, a loud bang echoed from within the mansion. John froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. The door to the mansion exploded outward, and a group of armed men rushed into the yard. They had been ambushed, and this time it was no coincidence. The trap had been set. The explosion sent a shockwave through the yard, the force knocking John off balance. He hit the ground hard, his weapon slipping from his grasp. His heart pounded as he scrambled to his feet, instinctively reaching for his gun. Sophia and Ruiz, who had been just a few feet behind him, were already diving for cover. Gunfire erupted from the mansion, bullets ricocheting off the ground near them as the attackers poured out from behind the windows and the door. "We've got company," Sophia shouted, raising her own weapon as she fired back. Ruiz, despite his injuries, managed to pull out his pistol and join the fight, his shot steady but clearly weaker than usual. John grabbed his gun and took cover behind a crumbling stone wall, scanning the yard for any sign of their attackers. He could see at least 5 men charging toward them, their movements sharp and coordinated. These weren't just random thugs. These were professionals, trained to handle situations like this. "Get to the house," John shouted, moving quickly. "We can't fight them here." Sophia nodded, motioning for Ruiz to follow. The 3 of them made a dash for the mansion, firing back as they moved. John's heart raced as he saw the front door of the building, now wide open. The attackers were surrounding it, but they were distracted by the gunfire from the trio. It was their chance. They reached the door and ducked inside, immediately seeking cover behind the thick stone walls that lined the entrance hall. Inside, the mansion felt eerily quiet compared to the chaos outside. Dust motes floated in the dim light that filtered through the boarded-up windows. But John knew the silence wouldn't last long. "We need a plan," Sophia said, panting as she crouched beside him. John scanned the space, his mind working at full speed. "We need to find out where they're holding the lieutenant. Once we get that information, we'll get out. Fast." Just as he said it, the unmistakable sound of boots echoed down the hallway. At least 2 men were advancing toward them. John motioned for the others to stay low and quiet. They needed to wait for the right moment. Sophia reached for a nearby chandelier, silently unscrewing one of the heavy glass fixtures. She had a plan of her own. The footsteps grew louder, and John's pulse quickened. As the men rounded the corner, John stood up from his crouch, catching them by surprise. He fired 2 shots, each hitting its mark. The attackers collapsed before they could even raise their weapons. "That was easy," Ruiz said, though his voice was strained from his earlier injury. John didn't share his confidence. "Stay sharp. This is only the beginning." They moved down the hallway, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The house seemed to stretch on forever, with no clear direction or layout. But they pushed forward, moving cautiously, checking every room as they passed. At the end of the hall, John spotted a heavy metal door. It was locked, but the hinges looked old, rusted. A soft thud echoed from the other side of the door, a sound too deliberate to be a coincidence. "This is it," John whispered. "He's in there." Sophia, her face grim, nodded. "Let's do it." John took a deep breath. They didn't have much time. He kicked the door with all his strength, the ancient was splintering under the force. Inside, the room was dimly lit, filled with filing cabinets and stacks of documents. A man, bound to a chair, looked up in surprise as they entered. "You're not one of Malcolm's," the man said, his voice hoarse. "Who are you?" John didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved quickly, pulling a knife from his belt and cutting the man's restraints. "We're here to get you out, but you're going to help us first." The man blinked, clearly confused. "Help you? Who are you?" John leaned in, his voice cold. "If you don't talk, we're leaving you here." We're not here to waste time. The man swallowed hard. You're looking for Malcolm, right? You've been chasing him for months, and now you found me. Sophia stepped forward. Start talking. The man nodded quickly. I'm one of his associates. I've worked with him for years. But things are worse than you think. He's not just involved in crime. He's got connections with some of the most dangerous people in the world. People you don't want to mess with. John clenched his jaw. Where is he? Tell me now. The man hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. Then, in a low voice, he spoke again. He's been hiding out in a location far from here. A mansion out in the hills, completely off the grid. It's protected by armed guards, cameras, everything. If you want to get to him, you'll need help. You'll need someone who knows the place. John's heart sank. This wasn't just a matter of getting evidence anymore. It was a full-scale assault, one that would require everything he had. Who else knows about this mansion? John asked. The man shook his head, fear evident in his eyes. Only a handful of people. And the only way to get past the security is to take out the guards. But you're going to need more than just firepower. You need someone who can hack into the system and disable the cameras and alarms. John exchanged a glance with Sophia. They were running out of time. Where do we find this hacker? The man leaned forward. I know someone. A guy named Jake. He's a tech genius, can hack into anything. He works out of a small apartment on the east side of town. But be careful. He's a wild card. You'll need to approach him with caution. John nodded, already moving toward the door. Stay here. If we don't come back for you, you stay put. Don't leave. The man nodded vigorously, his hand shaking. Sophia grabbed her gear. Let's go. We don't have much time. John led the way back down the hallway, careful not to make any noise. The mansion was still quiet, but they could hear the distant sound of their attackers searching for them. As they reached the exit, Ruiz stumbled slightly, still weak from his injury. But he refused to be left behind. Let's finish this, he said. Sophia looked at him with concern, but she didn't argue. They had a mission now, and there was no turning back. The three of them made their way to the car, their hearts racing. They had a hacker to find. But more importantly, they had a plan. But as they drove, John couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into another trap. The deeper they went into Malcolm's world, the more dangerous things were becoming. They were about to take on a criminal empire, and only one thing was certain: there was no way out unscathed. The drive to the east side of town was tense. The streets blurred past, the sound of the city growing quieter as they moved further away from the heart of the chaos. John's mind raced with the new information they had just learned. A mansion in the hills, protected by armed guards and surveillance systems. A hacker named Jake who could break through the security, but only if they played it right. John kept his eyes on the road, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. The information about the mansion and the hacker had only added more layers to the mystery. Malcolm was more connected than they had anticipated, and every step forward seemed to lead them deeper into a dangerous web. He couldn't afford to make mistakes. He wouldn't. Sophia sat in the passenger seat, her eyes scanning the rearview mirror and the dark streets ahead. Ruiz, despite his injury, sat behind John, his hand resting on his lap, his brow furrowed in thought. His strength was slowly returning, but John could see the strain. The wound had taken more out of him than he'd let on, and time was running out for all of them. After a few more minutes of driving, they finally reached their destination, a rundown building at the edge of the city. The apartment complex wasn't much to look at: cracked windows, chipped paint, and a general sense of decay. But John had been around long enough to recognize the signs. This was a hideout, a place where someone wanted to remain unseen. They parked a few blocks away and proceeded on foot, moving quickly and quietly through the narrow alleyways. Sophia led the way, her movements precise, while John kept his eyes on the surroundings. There was no telling who might be watching. We find Jake, Sophia whispered. We get the system shut down, and we take down Malcolm. Simple as that. John nodded, but a nagging feeling lingered in the back of his mind. Nothing about this was simple. They were in over their heads, and everyone in this game had something to lose. They reached the door of a nondescript apartment on the second floor. Sophia knocked twice, a sharp sound in the still night. The door creaked open, revealing a man with disheveled hair and dark circles under his eyes. He wore a hoodie and sweatpants, his arms crossed over his chest, clearly unamused by their presence. "You, Jake?" John asked, keeping his tone neutral but firm. The man eyed them carefully before answering. "Who's asking?" John didn't flinch. "We need your help." "And it's not a request." Jake scoffed but opened the door wider. "Yeah? You got a lot of nerve walking into my place like this." Sophia stepped forward, her voice calm but commanding. "We need access to a mansion security system. We're taking down a major criminal, and we don't have time to waste." Jake's eyes narrowed at the mention of a criminal. "You're not the first to come here asking for favors. But you better know I don't just help anyone. What's in it for me?" John stepped in before Sophia could respond. "You help us, and you'll get paid. I'll make sure of it. But you do this our way, and we walk away from here." Jake studied John for a moment longer, his fingers tapping against the doorframe. "All right, fine. But if I'm doing this, I need to know exactly who I'm helping and what you're up against. We're after a man named Brian Malcolm. He's one of the biggest names in organized crime, and we need to shut down his operation. We're going to need you to break into a mansion security and disable everything. Cameras, alarms, everything," John said, his tone direct. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Malcolm, huh? Yeah, I've heard of him. But that's no small task. You're talking about a guy with connections to some heavy hitters. This isn't something you walk in and walk out of." "I know," John replied. "That's why we need you." Jake looked at them for a moment, his eyes shifting between John and Sophia. "All right, I'll help. But this is risky. I can get into their system, but I need a few things first: computers, some equipment. I'll need time to set it all up, and I need a place where I can work without being interrupted." Sophia nodded. "You'll have everything you need. Just get us inside, and we'll take care of the rest." Jake stepped aside, gesturing for them to come in. "Fine. But if anything goes sideways, I'm out. You're on your own after that." John stepped into the apartment, followed by Sophia and Ruiz. The place was cluttered, old computer parts, wires, and screens scattered around the small space. It looked like a command center for someone who spent more time in the digital world than the real one. "Let me get set up," Jake said, moving to one of the desks. "I'll need a few hours, and I'm going to need some quiet. You guys stay out of my way, and we'll be good." John didn't need to be told twice. He and Sophia took a seat in the corner, trying to keep as low profile as possible. Ruiz slumped into a chair nearby, his injuries still weighing on him. The hours dragged by. John kept his focus on the door, his senses alert. It was far too quiet. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that they were already too deep in Malcolm's web. Finally, Jake looked up from his work. "All right, I've got access. I can shut down the cameras and alarms in under 5 minutes once you're in. You'll have to get to the security room yourself." John nodded, getting up from his seat. "We'll move fast. As soon as the system's down, we'll take out the guards and grab Malcolm." Sophia stood as well, her expression grim. "This is it. No more room for mistakes." Jake handed over a small device, a portable drive. "This'll get you through the security system. Once you're in, I'll keep the system down for as long as I can. But after that, you're on your own. I can't promise you'll have more than a few minutes." "Understood," John said, taking the device. They left Jake's apartment, each step heavier than the last. The weight of their mission pressed down on them. They weren't just dealing with criminals anymore. They were about to take on an empire, and the stakes had never been higher. As they made their way back to the car, John's phone buzzed. It was an encrypted message from an unknown number. He opened it, his eyes narrowing at the single line of text. "I know you're coming for me. You won't make it out alive." John's jaw tightened. It was from Malcolm, or someone close to him. The trap was set, and they had just walked right into it. Sophia glanced at him, sensing his reaction. "What is it?" John didn't answer immediately, instead staring at the screen. "It's a warning. Let's make sure it's the last one," Sophia said. John pocketed his phone and looked at the others. "This is it. We go in, take down the network, and end this for good. No matter what happens, we don't stop." With that, they climbed into the car, the road ahead uncertain, the final confrontation looming large. They were going after Malcolm, but they didn't realize just how much trouble they were about to face. The drive to the mansion felt like a slow march toward the inevitable. The message from Malcolm still burned in John's mind. "You won't make it out alive." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. As they neared the outskirts of the city, the road narrowed, and the mansion loomed ahead in the distance, perched on a hill like an imposing fortress. The moonlight glinted off its high windows, casting long shadows on the ground. The place looked abandoned, isolated, but John knew better than to trust appearances. Malcolm had eyes everywhere. John kept his focus on the road ahead, but his mind kept drifting back to the plan. They would disable the security, slip inside, and take down the guards. Jake had done his part, giving them access to the mansion's security system. But John couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Everything had gone too smoothly, and that made him nervous. Sophia, sitting in the passenger seat, was scanning the area as they approached. Her grip on her gun was firm, her eyes sharp. Ruiz was still in the back, his wound obviously bothering him, but his determination to finish the mission was clear. He refused to let his injuries stop him. "Stay alert," John said quietly as they neared the gates. "We don't know what's waiting for us inside." Sophia nodded. "We've come this far. No turning back." As they reached the gates, John slowed the car. The massive iron gates stood open, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. It was too easy. Everything was too quiet. "We're walking into a trap," John muttered. Sophia glanced at him, her face grim. "It's a trap we've got no choice but to walk into." They parked the car behind a large stone pillar near the entrance and got out, moving quickly and quietly toward the side of the mansion. John led the way, his senses heightened. He could hear nothing except the sound of his own breath and the soft crunch of gravel underfoot. They reached a service entrance at the side of the mansion. John glanced around once more before stepping forward. He pulled out the device Jake had given him, the portable drive that would disable the security system. "Ready?" he whispered to Sophia and Ruiz. Sophia nodded. Ruiz gave a weak thumbs up, clearly still struggling but unwilling to show weakness. John inserted the device into the control panel beside the door, his fingers moving quickly. A soft beep confirmed that it was working. The mansion's lights flickered, and the hum of the surveillance cameras died. "We're in," John said, voice low. "Let's move." Inside, the mansion was dark, the air thick with dust. The silence was unsettling, the only sound their footsteps echoing on the marble floors. They moved through the halls, staying low, their guns at the ready. John checked the map Jake had given them, which led him to a narrow hallway just past the grand staircase. At the end of the hallway was a heavy door. The security room. It was where the final confrontation with Malcolm would take place. "Stay sharp," John whispered. He approached the door, but as he reached for the handle, he froze. Something didn't feel right. The hairs on his neck stood up. "Move," he shouted suddenly. Gunfire erupted from the opposite side of the hall. The door to the security room exploded outward, and armed men stormed into the hallway. The attackers were everywhere. John dove to the side, taking cover behind a pillar as the first wave of bullets tore through the air. Sophia and Ruiz returned fire, but the attackers were well trained, moving quickly and precisely. "We've been set up," John gritted through his teeth, his mind racing. Sophia kept her cool, firing with accuracy. "We've got to get to that room. That's our way out." John nodded. They had no choice now but to fight their way through. But it wasn't just Malcolm's hired guns. They were up against a much larger force. More guards were coming from all sides. "Cover me," John shouted as he sprinted toward the security room. Sophia and Ruiz followed, their shots keeping the attackers at bay. Just as they reached the security door, another explosion shook the house, causing the walls to crack. A blinding flash of light engulfed the hallway, sending them all sprawling to the floor. John's ears rang, and for a moment, the world around him seemed to spin. He shook his head, trying to focus. He needed to act fast. "Get up," he shouted, pulling Ruiz to his feet. Sophia was already ahead, taking the lead, and John quickly followed. They made it to the security room and slammed the door shut behind them. Inside, the room was dimly lit, a series of monitors showing the estate's perimeter and the main hall. The screens were filled with static. Jake's work had held up. For now. Sophia went to work, grabbing the control panel. "I can hold the cameras off for a few minutes. We need to get Malcolm before they find us." John nodded. He knew what had to be done. Ruiz, you stay here. Cover us. Ruiz, though clearly exhausted, managed a weak smile. You're not leaving me behind. We'll be back. Stay put. John and Sophia stepped into the hall again, the sound of footsteps approaching fast. They knew they didn't have long before the security system would be restored and more attackers would flood the mansion. Their time was running out. The final hallway toward Malcolm's private office was narrow and lined with portraits. The air felt heavy, as if the mansion itself were holding its breath. John kept his pace steady, his eyes scanning every corner. As they neared the door to the office, John's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Jake. Get out. It's a trap. You're surrounded. John's stomach sank. They had known it was too easy. We need to move, John said urgently, shoving the phone back into his pocket. He reached for the door, turning the handle. And then, just as the door cracked open, gunfire tore through the air. John dove backward, pulling Sophia with him as a volley of bullets sliced through the door. He rolled to the side, taking cover behind a column in the hallway. Sophia cursed under her breath, her eyes wild. They know we're here. John looked back at the door. It's over. We're not getting out through the front door. A voice echoed down the hall, cold, calm, and unmistakable. John Carmichael, Malcolm's voice rang out, smooth and confident. You made a mistake coming here. You thought you were clever, but you've been playing into my hands all along. John's heart skipped a beat. He knew that voice. The final confrontation was here. I'll give you one chance to walk away, Malcolm continued. Leave now, and I'll let you live. John tightened his grip on his gun, his pulse pounding. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. I don't walk away, John growled. Not this time. And then, in the silence that followed, the battle for their lives began. The tension in the air was suffocating. John's heart raced as he crouched behind the column, his eyes darting toward the end of the hallway where Malcolm's voice had come from. He could hear the faint shuffle of footsteps, the sound of someone moving deliberately, carefully. Malcolm was close. The time for sneaking around was over. It was time for the final showdown. Sophia stood beside him, her weapon raised, her face set in grim determination. Ruiz, though injured, had managed to drag himself into the hallway with them, his gun ready, his resolve unbroken. Malcolm's voice echoed again, smooth and taunting. You fought your way through my men, Carmichael. But you can't win. I control everything here. You're trapped. John's jaw tightened. You're wrong, he muttered, glancing at Sophia. This ends tonight. He pushed forward, moving slowly, making sure his steps were silent. The mansion was eerily quiet now, the silence between their movements almost deafening. Every step brought them closer to the final confrontation. They reached the end of the hall, where a massive set of double doors stood before them. Behind them, Malcolm was waiting, surrounded by his remaining guards. John's mind raced. They couldn't afford to hesitate. We go in hard, we go in fast, John said to Sophia. Keep him off balance. Ruiz, stay close. Don't let anyone get to us. Sophia nodded, and Ruiz, despite his pain, gave a determined thumbs up. They were ready. No turning back now. John took a deep breath, pushed open the door, and they stormed into the room. The sharp click of the door closing echoed as they entered what could only be described as a fortress. The large room was tastefully furnished, but John's eyes were locked on the man standing at the far end, Brian Malcolm. He stood in front of a massive desk, his hands casually resting on it as he smiled. Well, Malcolm said, his voice calm, almost amused. The great John Carmichael, right where I wanted you. You've come all this way, and now you're going to die in my home. Not today, John said, his voice steady. Without another word, he dove to the side, firing at the guards who had been positioned near the walls. The sound of gunfire filled the room as both sides exchanged shots. It was chaos, but it was controlled chaos. John had been in far worse situations than this. He had the upper hand. Sophia was moving with precision, her shots hitting their targets, clearing the way. Ruiz, though injured, was firing with accuracy, his determination pushing him forward despite the pain. They were a well-oiled machine. But Malcolm wasn't backing down. He remained standing by the desk, unfazed by the firefight. He had to know this was his last stand. John could feel the weight of the moment. You think you're the hero in this story? Malcolm sneered. You're nothing but a pawn. You always have been. You're just a tool I use to clean up my mess. John's blood boiled at Malcolm's words, but he kept his focus. Every step was calculated, every shot intentional. He had one goal, Malcolm. The room was a blur of motion as they closed the distance between themselves and their target. John's eyes never left Malcolm, even as he took down two more guards in quick succession. Finally, they were face to face. Malcolm raised his hands in mock surrender. You're making a big mistake, Carmichael. You don't know what you're dealing with. You think you've won, but this is just the beginning. You have no idea who I'm really working with. John's response was a cold, hard glare. You're finished. Malcolm's smile faltered for just a second before he quickly regained his composure. We'll see about that. But just as he spoke, the lights flickered. John's instincts screamed at him. This wasn't right. He dove to the side, but it was too late. A figure appeared in the doorway, moving swiftly. A gunshot rang out, but it wasn't aimed at John. The bullet hit Malcolm in the chest. The room fell into stunned silence as Malcolm staggered back, his hand clutching his wound. He collapsed to the floor, his eyes wide in disbelief. A tall, dark figure stepped into the room. The silhouette was unmistakable, the long trench coat, the cold, calculating demeanor. It was Sophia. Her gun was still raised, smoke rising from the barrel. Malcolm's mouth moved, but no words came out. Blood poured from the wound, and he fell silent, his eyes glazing over as life slipped away. John stood frozen for a moment, his heart racing. He had expected this to be a battle to the end, but not like this. Sophia lowered her gun, her expression unreadable. I told you it was bigger than you thought, Carmichael, she said quietly. John blinked in confusion. What do you mean? Sophia's eyes softened, but only for a moment. Malcolm wasn't the head of the snake. He was just a tool. I've been tracking the real players for years, Carmichael. And now, with him out of the way, we can finally take them down. The realization hit John like a punch to the gut. Sophia hadn't been working with him. She had been working her own angle, taking Malcolm down in her own way. I've been undercover this whole time, she continued. I've been playing you, using you to get close to Malcolm. But now, with him gone, I can move on to the real players, the ones pulling the strings from the shadows. John's mind whirled. He had trusted Sophia, fought alongside her, and now she was revealing her true intentions. He didn't know what to say. You're not going to stop me, Carmichael, she said, her voice cold. I'm going to finish what I started. She turned to leave, but before she could make it to the door, John's voice stopped her. I won't let you do this, he said, his tone low and deadly serious. Sophia froze, her back to him. You're not in control here anymore, she said. You never were. John took a step forward, his hand tight on his gun. Maybe not, but I'm not letting you use me or anyone else to further your agenda. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. John's fingers tightened on the trigger, but before he could make his next move, Ruiz's voice cut through the tension. John, he said weakly, his gun still raised. We don't have to go down that path. Let her go. John hesitated, looking at Ruiz, then back at Sophia. The realization hit him again. This wasn't just about Malcolm. There was a bigger game at play, one that had drawn him in, whether he liked it or not. Sophia turned, her eyes hardening. You'll regret this. All of you. With that, she walked out of the room, disappearing into the shadows. John stood in the silence of the room, staring at the space where she had been. He didn't know what came next, whether he could trust anyone again. But for the first time, he realized that the battle he'd fought was just the beginning. The fight for freedom, for justice, for truth, it wasn't over. It was only just starting. And he would be ready.